there is a petition outside. There is a petition at the moment going to the British government. It's one of those nice little Write to David Cameron petitions that you need 100,000 signatures on. In order to trigger a debate in Parliament. Most of these petitions tend to be very popular if they're like anti, or I should say pro-racism, let's kick all the Romanians out of the country or something really pointless like that, or, everyone should be able to watch football for free or something, take it off Sky and put it on ITV or something like that. Those are, the trending petitions. Let's try and get this petition to trend. It needs about another 70,000 signatures in the next 5 or 6 weeks. So I've left some forms outside. Please could everybody make sure that their name goes onto that form, and so that we can add it into the names on the list for that petition. Another thing, if you've never taken part in an action before, there's one coming up, there's plenty coming up actually, but on the 23rd of this month, the Save Shakarama campaign is also going to be holding a day of action in South London. So if you're from South London, you really don't have an excuse because it's probably local to you. At 12 o'clock, starting outside Tooting Mosque, I'm not from South London, so I don't know where that is. They will be holding a day-long worth of action to get more signatures on this petition and raise awareness of Shakarama's case. He is from South London. He has a British family living in South London, and so that's part of the reason that they want to raise more awareness. If you've never taken part in an action before, why not? So, in a couple of weeks' time, give it a go. It's not really as scary as all that. I have actually worked with the families of people who are prisoners who have been convicted, not on criminal cases and things like that. So I can actually say that, even then, for women whose husbands and sons and brothers and whoever else, men in their families might be in prison for theft or fraud or something like that, it's still a difficult situation. There's still mental anguish. There's still other issues that they have to deal with. I don't like the word suffering. I don't like victimization. I believe in empowerment instead. And one of the reasons why women and children suffer, I would say, have a different level of pressures is simply because they are left behind. So if the police come and kick someone's house door down, take the man away, he's got pressures to deal with when he's in jail. They have got other things to deal with outside. They've got to deal with the neighbors. They've got to get that door fixed. They've got to, have the kids tell their friends and their teachers and everyone else at school. And what about the family? I mean, in so many cases, people have actually been isolated by their own families. Forget everyone else wanting to speak to them. Their own brothers and sisters don't want to speak to them. So there is that issue as well. And as I said, there's the mental health problems that come up with it too. One of the worst things that I have found from the people who I have worked with is the arbitrary nature of the detention. When A, you don't know why you're being detained, and B, you don't know how long. How long is that's the hard part, because real criminals know how long they've been sentenced for. They know when they're likely to be paroled or released. But people when you're a suspect for 15 years, you have no idea, okay? Final point I would like to make. We have been looking at women who are affected by these issues who tend to be Muslim women. It's not actually a given fact that Muslim people have to be related to Muslims. So it's quite possible that the women who are suffering and the children who are suffering are not Muslims. Because, Muslim men can have non-Muslim wives and they can have non-Muslim mothers and they can have non-Muslim sisters. And when we started our campaign for Guantanamo Bay, we were actually told by one of the non-Muslim sisters of one of the men that she wished there was a similar kind of support network for her when her brother was in Guantanamo Bay. So let's not try and think of this in very narrow terms. Let's not try and think of this as being something that affects a very small number of people. This is actually a big problem. It's everybody's problem, and that's why it's something we should all be doing something about. First thing you can do is sign that petition outside. Thank you.
Now our next speaker is Liz Fekete. Liz is the director of the Institute of Race Relations, which I'm proud to be on the council. And as far as my book is concerned, she has been the main person who told me, no, you can't have that bit. Why don't you have more on this? And she's played this amazing editorish role for me, which I'm really grateful to. Aisha talked about information. And one of the things that CagePrisoners does very well, as she said, is produce a lot of information. At the same time, I would urge you to look at the Institute of Race Relations weekly analysis and reporting of the things that don't get reported. It's a really, really invaluable source of information. And Liz has a very long experience in all the kind of struggles that these women are involved in and the wider struggles of our society, which I think at this point are so completely obviously critical to all of us. And there couldn't be anyone better than Liz to speak to us.
I've been a friend to Victoria, and she won't like me for starting by saying a few words about her, but I will, even though she'll probably be very cross with me later. I've known Victoria for 30 years. I first met her in 1983 when there was, I just started to work at the Institute of Race Relations. I was a very nervous 20-ish odd young lady who just left university. And we do a journal called Race and Class, and there'd been a coup in Kenya, and Victoria was on the Kenya committee, and we were bringing out a special issue of our journal, and my job, because I rode my bike everywhere, was to cycle around, pedal around on my bike, delivering all these articles to people. And I used to go to Victoria's house, and she always used to offer me a nice glass of orange juice with ice, because she was very worried that I was tired after my cycling. But I was always too frightened to go in, because she was the foreign editor of The Guardian, and I was nobody. I didn't know what I could possibly talk to her about. So the reason that I started with that sort of long garbled story is that during those 30 years that I've known Victoria, she's written many, many books on Palestine, on Africa, on so many things. But I know that this book is more important to her than any book that she has written, because it's a book that came to her not out of social commitment, not out of her journalistic ethos to seek out the truth, but it's a book that came to her out of friendship, and it is more precious than any other book that she's written. Last week, we were at the London Review of Books, where Victoria was launching the book in conversation with Louise Christian. And the chair, who was from the bookshop, it was a very different venue from this. It was in Covent Garden, and there were sort of glasses of wine and canapes and things like that. No criticism. And the chair was a very, very nice man, very earnest. And he turned around to Victoria and said, "Well, how did you possibly get to know these women? I mean, you're so different from them. I mean, you're not pious, you're not religious. How did you get this inroad into their lives?" And it struck me as the most funny thing to say, because underpinning his question was this notion that you cannot have a friend who's different from you. And there's a lot of kids in the audience, and I'm sure they'll remember how exciting it is to have a friend who's very different from you. And this notion that you cannot be a non-religious person and have a friend who is religious is, for me, one of the most horrible things that has emerged out of this war on terror on a personal level. Friendship is about listening, it's about caring, it's about sharing. And if you only do that with someone who's exactly the same as you, it's not friendship, it's narcissism, it's self-love. So I think this way that society is telling us through the anti-terrorist laws, through the constant media onslaught around, oh, women who wear the hijab, women who wear the burqa, men who have beards, oh, they're so different, we need to be scared of them. This is something that is deeply worrying about our society, and it's happening at a very profound level, and we need to challenge it. And all of it comes from the war. The war on terror creates enemy images, and it's these enemy images that we are imbibing every day. And this is what's so important about this book, because the words of the women in this book teach us all those things at a very simple human level. And I think what Victoria has done, the book is the women's book. It's their words, it's their testimonies. It's their testament. She's just the chronicler. She's the chronicler of other people's stories. And what she has chronicled is like, through these women's words, is the most incredible stories of everyday cruelty in our society. Just as we're becoming a society that is becoming more scared of difference, we're also becoming a much more cruel society. And by that I mean we're taught every day the newspapers give us some headline about some monster who's committed some awful crime. But actually a lot of cruelty comes out of stupidity and comes out of the kind of modern bureaucracies that we live in. This cruelty that's documented in the book is state-sanctioned cruelty. And that's the kind of cruelty which means that individual immigration officers, individual police officers, individuals who think that they are moral people do the most immoral things, like putting Baba Ahmed and Talha Hassan on a plane to the United States of America, where they are going to be treated in conditions which are similar to torture. And this is the thing that is frightening, and this is the thing that the book teaches us. I think the other thing about Victoria, which I think is very important about the book, is read the introduction. She very, very simply gives us this geopolitical sweep and this way of understanding what's happening in the world. And I think this is the second reason why Victoria feels so strongly. You know, I started off with talking about what happened in Kenya and Victoria's involvement in struggles around Africa. Once the world was, we've seen the world divided into the so-called superior Western world and the backward Muslim world. But once upon a time, the world was equally divided into the so-called liberal, capitalist, progressive bloc and the communist world. And all during that period, Victoria worked to stop the kind of building of walls and bridges in this so-called Cold War period. And during that period, people like Victoria, myself, other people in this room who didn't accept this way of understanding what was happening in Africa, what was happening in the Middle East, we would then be called fellow travellers with communism. People who tried to speak out, we were fellow travellers. Now Victoria is a fellow traveller with violent jihadism. Well done, Victoria. And just to say something encouraging, and I don't say this about this earlier period to anyway diminish or belittle the suffering and the pain that people are going through, but to give you a sense of hope. Because these things happened in history and they can be overcome. Apartheid was overcome. And there was one woman, I just want to, because it is International Women's Day, there was one woman called Claudia Jones, an African Caribbean woman who set up the West Indian Gazette in this country and actually started the Notting Hill Carnival. Well, Claudia Jones was actually a communist, and she was actually deported from the United States of America under the notorious McCarran-Walter Immigration and Nationality Act that allowed for the deportation of immigrants or naturalised citizens engaged in subversive activities. So this is the continuum. Claudia Jones was a subversive and outcast from society. She's someone now that we honour in Black History Month. So there is hope, but we must redouble our efforts. And I just want to go back to conclude, to tell you about the second thing that happened at that London Review of Books meeting, which also sort of amused me greatly. So we got to this end of this sort of wonderful presentations, hearing about the horrors that's going on in the name of the war on terror. And this sort of young man at the back of the room sort of got up. He was very urgent. He wanted to make the first intervention. He'd obviously read a lot of books, but didn't know a lot about the world. And he basically started to tease. Victoria said it was like he was teasing her. But basically he was saying, I'm a progressive person, and you, Victoria, how are you serving the progressive cause by talking to these women and who are ultra-conservative, subversive, and believe in God, for goodness sake. You know, you can't be a progressive and believe in God. And I wish I'd been a little bit more on the ball, and I wish I'd sort of, you know, put him down a little bit. for goodness sake, can you really be a progressive person in this society if you believe that you can't talk to someone who's different from you? I mean, we're going back to this idea. For me, at the heart of all progressive politics lies pluralism. So these meetings are very important. Meetings like this where we come together is an act of defiance against this mindset which says that we all have to be the same, we all have to be, we all have to conform. And I think sometimes we need to go back to the very basics, to just start being more human. So let's celebrate International Women's Day and also make it a celebration of friendship. I think Victoria has been very, very brave in writing this book, and she's set a standard. She's our reference, and I think we should thank her for that. But the women's testimony, these women's lives are a mirror of the society that we have become. And I think from this meeting, we have to go out and start the process of examining our world and the reflection of theirs. Thank you.
I want to thank you all very, very much for coming, on behalf of myself, obviously, and on behalf of CagePrisoners. And I think it's fantastic that CagePrisoners decided to do a launch of this book and celebrate International Women's Day. And by doing that, I think it makes a statement about what are the real values behind CagePrisoners. Now, it's been my privilege to work with CagePrisoners for nearly 10 years. It started when I helped Mozem to write his book. And at that point, I was on a fairly narrow focus, just doing that. But I had a secret weapon, and the secret weapon is in the room, but I'm not even going to look at her because she'll be embarrassed. It was a person who became one of my closest friends. And while on the one hand, I had Mozem giving me his account of all the terrible things that had happened to him, on the other hand, I had my secret weapon, who was showing me what it is to live and bring up a family under the same kind of difficulties that Mozem is talking about, but managing to make a whole oasis of joy. And in fact, my secret weapon is not the only one in the room. There are two others, and I'm very busily not looking at them, but they know who they are. And I think one of the things that comes out of this book is the way the strength of faith of these women has made it possible for them to overcome all the horrible isolation, the cruelty of control orders, the cruelty of having no letters from Guantanamo for years, the women whose husbands are on UN asset freezing sanctions, which means they can touch no money. All these horrible bureaucratic cruelties and political cruelties that Liz and Aisha both referred to, against them, there have always been these amazing women. And for me, that's what this evening is about. And I'm incredibly honored that they made their journeys from different parts of South and West and North London to be with us. Because somebody talked about role models earlier. There are only these role models as far as I'm concerned. But I just want to remind us that could we have imagined 11 years ago that today there would still be 166 men in Guantanamo Bay? And of those 166, 157 have no charges against them. And of them, 87 have been cleared. They've been cleared by the highest American intelligence and military authorities that there are. And yet those people, like Shaka, who was mentioned earlier, are still there. Of course, I want us to focus on Shaka because he matters so much to so many people in this room. But I just want to put someone else's name into your mind, because along with the wives and mothers that we have here tonight, there's a mother who sticks in my mind. She's a Kuwaiti mother who I met 10 years ago, and I never, ever imagined that 10 years on, her son, who's called Fawzi al-Auda, and I urge you to Google him, look him up on Cage Prisoners, and you'll find the story of Fawzi, who was a gentle student who went to Pakistan and worked in the most deprived areas, and that was what he thought was his religious duty. The story of how Fawzi got taken, sold, and taken to Guantanamo, and the fact that today, while we're sitting here, Fawzi is one of those on hunger strike at Guantanamo Bay. When I think about his mother, and we aren't with her, I just want to ask you all to remember her and Fawzi in your prayers. Apart from that, I just want to say I've been on a very steep learning curve for 10 years, and I thank not only my darling secret weapons, my dear, dear friends, for accompanying me and showing me another life, but I want to thank my colleagues in the Institute of Race Relations and in Cage Prisoners for supporting me all the way.